this government is obsessed with remaining in power. And it seems willing to do whatever it takes to remain in power. We have seen, for example, in the parliamentary system, governments fall for much, much less dishonorable things taking place. The government has something to hide, and we don't know what that is because they are invoking national security to hide their own incompetence.
Adam So's here for Rebel News, and in just a few moments, I'm going to be joined by Marco Navarro-Génie. He is the founding president of the Haultain Research Institute. He has an extensive background serving as a professor, as well as serving as a vice president and president of a number of prestigious public policy institutions. Definitely great to pick his expert brain on some of these critical issues. He recently put out a paper, a release effectively decrying just how backwards Ottawa's national security priorities are under Justin Trudeau, and I had the opportunity to join him to discuss that release. All right, Marco, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. When I had an opportunity to read that paper you sort of put out discussing how Ottawa has its national security sort of priorities completely backwards, I found it incredibly interesting. I wanted to first touch on and sort of establish a baseline for an expectation for a federal government. And I think one of the things that we could probably agree to, whether you're a staunch libertarian or a progressive, is that national security is probably one of those things that falls into the clear responsibility of a federal government. Is that right?
Yes. National governments exist for many purposes, but one of the key purposes of a federal government in a federation is to maintain the integrity and the security of the state. That means the security of government, the integrity of its institutions, and also the integrity and security of its citizens. So a federal government is supposed to protect the country from internal attacks and from external attacks.
So with this federal government under Trudeau not meeting sort of minimum target NATO contributions, I believe it's something like 2% of GDP, failing to address those sort of core principle things, especially with sort of Russia on the prowl in the Arctic. There's some vulnerabilities there. China looking for vulnerabilities. Does that make Canada look weak and vulnerable on the national stage?
Yes. To be fair, not many of the NATO countries actually meet their targets. So, and Canada has not been meeting their targets for a long time. What is new here is the irresponsibility of announcing it to the four winds. So what you're saying is, we don't have a lock on our door. We don't even have a security system. Come on down, right? Considering that, the main two predators, China and Russia, are countries with which we have had conflicts lately, and we are essentially engaging in a war by proxy with the Russians at the moment. This seems like an irresponsible thing to do. It is true that we have been far too quick in invoking issues of national security when it comes to basic, almost pedestrian issues. The most notorious, of course, is the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. Sure, there was a whole bunch of trucks making noise, and some of them were even blocking some parts of the street. The streets were by and large open because they kept a lane open. One needs to emphasize that because they're now peddling this idea that all the streets were blocked. They were not. And there was partying on the streets, and there were bouncy castles every couple of blocks for the children, and burgers being distributed. This does not rise to the level of a threat to national security or an existential threat, as they said. Certainly not enough to call police from across the country, to trample Canadian citizens under the hooves of the federal police, to essentially seize bank accounts for the mere crime of having donated $20 to the protesters. We have now policemen who have lost their jobs or have been fined and punished because they contributed to the protest. I mean, none of this rises to any level of threats to the existential nature of the country.
Now, something that some might suggest does reach that level, but has seen very little opposition, very little reaction, is the Chinese police stations effectively operating within our country. That I mean, you might see an embassy operating in another country or some sort of initiative, but to have sort of a secondary police force enforcing the will of the Chinese communist regime within Canada and no one speaking out about it, very little media attention, is that more likely a very real national security threat? Is that undermining our national security, and why is it not being addressed?
Well, for starters, it violates Canada's sovereignty. Right? Canada has different levels of police. They are all established by constitutional authority through different governments. That a foreign government comes and opens up shop and starts essentially setting up an institution of their own to threaten Canadian citizens who may or may not be of Chinese origin, but that's beside the point, is essentially a threat to the sovereignty and to the national security of the country. But it goes further than that. We know, for example, that there were Chinese nationals that got fired from a high-level virology lab in Winnipeg. The government, up to today, and this was nearly 3 years ago, they have refused to answer questions about why this was. There is good circumstantial evidence that these people were spying for China. Yeah. Nothing was done. There is enough evidence now, and evidence, by the way, that came out through the newspapers, through leaks, that China has been intimidating Canadian citizens, including members of parliament, that China has been intimidating their own nationals in this country, that they have tried to meddle with elections and favor different candidates that they thought were friendlier to China or less hostile to China. All these things amount to essentially threats to the security and the integrity of our institutions. If some other country starts messing with our elections, if some other country starts threatening members of parliament who make decisions about laws and policies in this country, that is, short of essentially attacking us, is a pretty high level of threat. And yet the Prime Minister, claimed not to know at the beginning. Now he's trying to sort of paint it as, this stuff happens all the time. And that the National Security Advisor found out about Michael Chung being threatened by Chinese interference from the Globe and Mail. I mean, how bad does it need to be? So there is a fundamental ineptitude at the heart of this government that essentially renders our national security apparatus very porous.
So continuing on that notion of the Chinese election interference, obviously we also saw Trudeau basically hiring a former friend, a member of the Trudeau Foundation, David Johnston. Now, there was some criticism of this, but I think the criticism and the coverage within the media was mostly sort of reporting what the Conservatives were saying. It wasn't necessarily criticizing itself. There was a lot of defenses saying, well, this guy's beyond reproach. That sort of level of conflict of interest on such a critical issue, an issue of the sovereignty of the nation in many ways. Why is it that the media is so apprehensive to actually cover these issues and call Justin Trudeau out on these massive failings?
If we go with the theory that many of these media outlets are playing interference for the government, there is a certain fear that what the government is suspected of hiding may come out. And if that were the case, it would make the government collapse. Look, the issue of Johnston is not whether he is capable or incapable, whether he's a moral man or an immoral man. The fact is that we have a situation in which there are serious national security problems, and the government refuses to answer. There are all kinds of mechanisms in a liberal democracy that processes that must be conducted in secrecy are opened up for scrutiny. There are committees of parliament, there is question period in parliament, there is the press, there are experts who watch this sort of thing. None of these people have secured any kind of answer about what is going on at the heart of the national security apparatus in the country. And so in light of a wave of questions, the Prime Minister comes and appoints this individual which is not at all contemplated in any of the processes in the country, to go and find out what's going on. And of course, there are all kinds of credibility issues because he's not a national security expert, even though he has one of the highest clearances because he's Governor General. But the issue is he doesn't know really what to ask. And when you look at the most recent report and compare it, for example, to the one that was just published 2 days ago, commissioned by the French National Assembly, and when you look at the robustness of the analysis in the French document versus the Bush League, really, of the former Governor General's report, there are serious questions. One does not have to have any kind of animosity towards former Governor General Johnston. Quite the opposite. It is perfectly feasible to have enormous respect for the job that he did as Governor General and be kind of contemptuous that he has allowed himself to be a pawn and played interference in a political game. That's on him. That the Prime Minister would want to manipulate him and put him in there as a kind of shield. Sure, politicians will do that. They will use people. But it is kind of disappointing that an experienced individual like David Johnston would allow himself to be played that way.
Yeah, it seems like, and this has been the defense, that he's such a credible individual, no one should dare question this. Well, they seem to take that into consideration when they appointed him. Getting back to the sort of core issue, though, here, Trudeau's incompetency on matters of national security, Ottawa having everything backwards, they seem more inclined to go after their own people than to actually stand up for Canada abroad. Perhaps playing a little bit on your experience in Nicaragua, is this the type of thing that you see before a country stops being a free country? The forces that are meant to safeguard freedoms are in fact being flipped and turned against the people. Is there any concern that that's the start of what's happening here under Trudeau?
There is in this way. This government is obsessed with remaining in power. And it seems willing to do whatever it takes to remain in power. We have seen, for example, in the parliamentary system, governments fall for much, much less dishonorable things taking place, whether they're ethical or matters of national security or what have you. And what is clear here and seems to point at the fact that the government has something to hide. And we don't know what that is because they are invoking national security to hide their own incompetence. What threatens the institutions of the country is that they are willing to trade the interference and they are willing to trade the undermining of our electoral processes, to name one example, for the sake of their advantage. It has come to light that the Chinese have a preference for the weakness of the Liberal government in power. Right. And so they are undermining the other guys to the favor of these. In other words, the people in power have something to gain from what is going on, and they are willing to allow it or turn the other way for the sake of gaining that advantage. The word treason has already come up. A couple of weeks ago, an expert in national security said that this is starting to look like treason. I take that to be an opening of the door, even if it's just a crack, so that we can have that conversation.
Yeah, and that's certainly not light allegations. I mean, ultimately what that would boil down to is that our government is beholden to, whether it be globalist influencers, whether it be the Chinese government, whatever it may be. Do you think that is potentially what's happening here? Is they're acting whether in their own interest or because they're beholden to somebody other than the people who vote for them, other than the people they're supposed to be representing?
It seems those are the questions really that we would all love to ask, and that should come out in a public hearing. The issue really is, regardless of their intentions, the security of the state is being undermined, and they are reaping some kind of advantage. The imagination lights up when the Trudeau Foundation comes into play, for example, because we know that there is a kind of triangle in which donations have gone into the foundation and then they ricochet into access to the people who are donating to the foundation. And we know that, the Trudeau has been very, very open to essentially receive large amounts at these sort of gatherings for granting access to, a lot of the times, very powerful Chinese individuals who have connections to the Communist Party or to the Chinese army. And so it's hard to know. What we do not know. The answer to your question responsibly is we do not know. But it is hard to imagine that they don't have anything to hide. And somebody who doesn't have anything to hide, a government that does not have anything to hide, would be calling a public inquiry themselves, and they already would have held 3, if you think about it, because that would make them smell like roses, right? But nothing smells like roses here. Quite the opposite. There's a few rotten things hiding under the furniture. We don't know what it is, but journalists and people who are poking around are already getting a whiff of it.
And so finally, I know the sort of title of this article was that Ottawa has its national security priorities backwards. Is that, in your opinion, intentionally so because they're using it for nefarious purposes? Or do you think it's a matter of ineptitude?
I think both. There is actually room for both. It's backwards in a sense because they are using the national security apparatus to quell dissent and criticism and protest inside the country. And so it's a misuse of the resources against its own citizens. It's also backwards, of course, because part of those resources should be put into play and in place to try to stem all this interference from foreign powers. And so there is it's more than a wordplay. There is in fact a reversal.
Well, always great to get your insight on these issues. Definitely check out the Haultain Research Institute. Marco Navarro-Génie, the founding president of that incredible organization. As always, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Sos. Everybody, I just wanted to take this opportunity to ask you to consider subscribing to Rebel News Plus. It's an opportunity to support this independent journalism that we're doing, to keep us on the ground, telling these stories, telling the other side of the story, and asking important questions that you want answers to. But you're not just supporting us and getting nothing in return. In fact, you get access to the Gun Show, the Ezra Levant Show, and our incredible exclusive documentaries that you can't really see anywhere else. So again, consider subscribing to Rebel News Plus at rebelnews.com.